Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom, U.S. History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Now, as you can see, our topic today is the Cold War era international policy of the administrations of Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy. So let's get right to this. But first, as I always remind you, take a minute right now, hit pause on your screens, and quickly jot down the outline. Take note of the outline on the right, and of course, pay particular attention as we talk today about the key terms on your left. You are always expected to know the who, what, where, when, and why. Each of those terms is significant to U.S. history. Now with that, let's begin. Now our last talk, we've been talking a great deal about the Cold War and its impact on our domestic lives in the United States. And in fact, in the 1950s, early 1960s, the Cold War era had a profound impact with the Cold War consensus, creating a culture of fear and a culture of conformity. But today, however, we need a transition. We have not talked about was how the Cold War was really pushed on an international level. And so today we're going to talk about the administrations of Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy and how they dealt with the Cold War foreign policy. So let's begin with, of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower, elected in 1952, took office in January 1953. Now, under Dwight D. Eisenhower, it can be summed up in pretty much one word, and that word is brinkmanship. Now, let me explain. You see, Eisenhower was a staunch anti-communist, a staunch Cold Warrior. Now, when he became president in 1953, he appointed the man pictured on your screen, John Foster Dulles, to be his Secretary of State. Now, let me give you a brief background here about Mr. Dulles. You see, he was the son of a minister, and he viewed the Cold War in staunch religious terms, within a staunch religious ideology. You see, he saw the Cold War as a struggle, this epic battle between good and evil, between God, the United States, and Satan, the Soviet Union, communism. In other words, the United States with democratic capitalism good, and, well, communism under totalitarian regime in the Soviet Union bad. And you need to stamp it out. And he was personally quite dissatisfied with the containment policy of Harry Truman. He believed it to be weak and ineffective. Again, it wasn't enough to just contain communism in Dulles' eyes, but rather you need to eradicate it. And so he doesn't want to accept the U.S. presence he doesn't want to accept the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe at all. He believes that you need to convince Eisenhower to go send in the American troops and literally push back the Soviet Union from Eastern Europe. Now, the problem with this is, yes, you are risking taking a Cold War and making it World War III. Second problem is, even if you can convince the president of this, remember, Eisenhower is a Republican, and he's somewhat hesitant to spend money and expand government. Now, he's already done so, as we'll see, for the Eisenhower Highway Act. Talked about that last time. But it would be a tremendous expansion of resources, government, of course, money and troops, if you were to send in troops to Eastern Europe. And so Dulles, that is never fully successful in convincing Eisenhower to heat up the Cold War to that level. So the reality is, despite all of his pushing, as far as the official policy, containment is still the norm. But this containment under Dulles would be strengthened and institutionalized. And his stamp on containment became known as deterrence or brinkmanship. You see, his plan was, let's not spend a lot of money now. He wanted to, Eisenhower rejected it. So once Eisenhower rejected it, Dulles says, okay, fine. not spend money. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to spend money only on military buildup. And we're going to not use intervention, but just buildup and that threat. So again, we're going to limit the money spent, and instead we're going to use the threat of a nuclear holocaust to scare the ever-living crap out of the Soviet Union. In other words, we're going to use the threat of war to, quote-unquote, detour the Soviet Union. In other words, we are constantly going to be on the brink of pushing that button. So the thought is Eisenhower's fingers constantly on the button, on the brink of a nuclear holocaust to deter the Soviet Union. And this became known as brinkmanship because we are constantly on the brink of war. And again, the idea was to scare the Soviet Union into retreating. Now, is this effective? Not particularly, because the brinkmanship policy of the 1950s only worsened the relations between the Soviet Union and the United States. And of course, it heightened tensions. And the problem was, for much of the 50s, we seemed like we were, as the United States, that we were playing defense constantly because communism seemed to be spreading. In this case, not to Eastern Europe where Dulles was focused, but instead into Asia. And Asia became the new battleground of the 1950s and later 1960s of the Cold War. First and foremost, in 1949, communism comes to China. Under General Mao Zedong, he will form the People's Republic of China, and in 1949, China goes communist. Now, this has been a long time coming. Prior to World War II, General Mao had been trying to institute communism already in China. Now, to his credit, during World War II, he stopped the attack on the current China regime and focused the attention on fighting the Japanese. But as soon as the war is over, he resumed his attack to overthrow the government, and in 1949 he does. And of course, in the 1950s, he will launch what he called the Great Leap Forward to quickly industrialize China and bring it up to the levels of Western powers, which will be a monumental disaster as people abandon farming and instead try to industrialize. Depending on who you believe, somewhere between 18 and 45 million people died as part of the Great Leap Forward of people in China. Now, again, depending on who you believe. China says 18 million. The West, including the United States, estimate 45 million because China wants to make themselves look better. I'm sorry. 18 million is still a lot of dead people. But nonetheless, what happens though in 1949 is we resort back to our anti-Chinese ways in the United States. Remember, from 1882, we banned Chinese, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we banned Chinese immigrants. Well, finally, during the war, 1943, we said, oh, wait, they're suddenly our allies in the war. Maybe we should let them in now. And we became somewhat, at least on the surface, more friendly to China. That lasted all of 6 years because in 1949, we sever our diplomatic ties, we sever trade with China. So what does China do? Well, they cozy up and get in bed even tighter with Soviet communist Russia. Even though it'll be a marriage of convenience, General Mao and Stalin never really got along very well. But still, they're both communists and they will support each other in their quest to, well, defeat the United States and democratic capitalism. And so, well, Soviet Union, we're on the brinkmanship. In China, they turned communist. Let's move further south into Southeast Asia and look at what was known as French Indochina. Because while this is going on in China, trouble's brewing in what is known as French Indochina. Of course, this is modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And of course, back before World War I and through World War II, this is an area that had been colonized by the French. And of course, post-World War II, many of these areas were seeking to have independence to overthrow their colonial overlord. which in some respects makes sense. These were French colonies. They want their independence and freedom. Well, especially the hotspot became North Vietnam, in the northern half of what became modern Vietnam. And in this region, these nationalist movements were afoot, and they were trying to, somewhat reasonably, throw the French out of the country. They want to evict the French. And in the north of what is now Vietnam, a communist revolutionary and Vietnamese nationalist by the name of Ho Chi Minh, he was able to take control of northern Vietnam in 1945. He proclaimed northern Vietnam as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, created a new capital of Hanoi, and he created what was known as the Viet Minh government. So Ho Chi Minh, he used his last name Minh, and so he created the Viet Minh government. Now, the French, however, don't want to have to deal with this, and unfortunately for them, Ho Chi Minh begins to challenge France's effort in the south of Vietnam. So in the north, he takes control, but in the south, he begins to challenge French control. Now, the French see the writing on the wall. Everyone wants the French gone. So before they leave, though, they decide to install a brand new government in South Vietnam, to prevent it from falling to communism. And so in 1949, on their way out, the French set up the former emperor as to lead South Vietnam. His name was Bo Dai. Now, so in 1949, we have the situation in Vietnam. In the north half of Vietnam, we have Ho Chi Minh, he was a communist, he's a nationalist, and he wants to unify all of Vietnam under his communist regime. However, this was 1946. In 1949, the French are leaving the country finally, and they installed the former emperor, Bo Dai, to lead the South Vietnam to prevent its fall to communism. So in 1949, we have two countries, two states, both calling themselves the true Vietnam. Now, immediately, both sides have legitimacy. And this becomes how Vietnam becomes a proxy war in the Cold War, larger Cold War scheme. Because in 1949, as the French leave, we have two Vietnams. Immediately, the Chinese and the Soviets will recognize the North Vietnamese government as the true legitimate government under Ho Chi Minh because they're communist sympathizers. The South, however, under Bo Dai, will be recognized by Western nations, which, of course, Western nations like the United States, like Britain, France, they will refuse to trade with the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh, which only pushes Ho Chi Minh even closer to China and ultimately the Soviet Union. This makes Vietnam a key battleground in the Cold War era for obvious reasons. So what does this have to do with the Eisenhower administration? Well, during the early years 1950s of the Eisenhower administration, fighting in Vietnam had escalated between the French and the Viet Minh forces, the North Vietnamese forces. However, in 1954, both sides, all sides, the French, the South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, all reached an agreement known as the Geneva Accords. You see it pictured here. They are going to hammer out a way to unify or reunify Vietnam. And what they agree is, at the Geneva Accords in 1954, that we are going to temporarily divide North and South Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Okay, we're divided in half. North is communist, the South is, well, at least not communist. They also agree, however, that 2 years later, 1956, there would be a national election, both North and South, and this would reunify Vietnam. People would choose whether they wanted communism or not communism. I'm hesitant to call it democratic capitalism, even though that was what it was touted as, because under no circumstances could this ever be considered how we consider democratic capitalism there. And so this plan was divided temporarily for 2 years, cease fire, And we will come back, have a national election, and reunify in 2 years, 1956. Now, during this 2 years, the United States becomes even closer with the South Vietnamese. Because what we're worried about is that what if, crazy idea, 1956 comes around and the South Vietnamese vote for communism. Of course, we're worried about the old idea that Truman did called the domino effect. We already had China fall, North Vietnam had fell. Well, suddenly now South Vietnam falls, then Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and it keeps cascading across Southeast Asia until all of Asia is communist. The domino effect once again. In other words, we want containment. And so the containment in action was to prevent the South from falling to communism. And again, this is a good example of a proxy war. Even though we don't have troops on the ground yet, we are using the Vietnamese people as pawns to fight the Cold War for us against Soviet Russia. So meanwhile, we do realize Bo Dai is a bad leader, and we help install a new leader. And this is at America's urging. We're going to install a brand new leader in South Vietnam known as No Dien Diem. And Eisenhower promises Diem that we will protect South Vietnam from subversion by communists. And in return, Diem is going to enact democratic reforms. You see here, he's touring the United States. He's going to speak at the commencement ceremony of Michigan State University. Those poor students in 1957, that poor graduating class. Because the reality was, while we tout him as being a savior and a hero that will prevent communism, who's going to install greater democratic reforms, the reality is he was kind of a douchebag. And he suppressed political oppression. He opposed democratic reforms. In fact, under Diem, the South Vietnamese government became corrupt and very oppressive. In fact, in 1956, he's the one who will refuse to allow the elections to go on. Remember, 1956, under the Geneva Accords, we're going to have a national election to decide communism or not, but either way, reunify Vietnam. Diem calls off the election because he knows he's going to lose. And following this canceling of the election, his suppression of political opposition only intensifies. And of course, this suppression plays right into the hands of the Northern Viet Minh forces. Because they've been saying all along that, democratic capitalism, the South are evil, the West is evil, communism is the way of the future. And he's doing exactly what they fear, which is political suppression. This is against what they want. And of course, this allows the Northern Viet Minh forces under Ho Chi Minh to be able to recruit a number of sympathizers in the South who will begin using guerrilla-style warfare tactics. They begin to call themselves the Viet Cong, these Southern communist sympathizers who just want to get rid of Diem and reunify Vietnam. Now, by 1960, these forces come together, the Viet Minh in the north, the Viet Cong in the south, and they will form what's called the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong. And their goal, again, is to reunify Vietnam under the Viet Minh control, under Ho Chi Minh and communism. So China's fallen to communism. North Vietnam has fallen to communism, and the South is under extreme attack thanks to some pretty terrible government officials, including both Bo Dai and No Dien Diem. How are things back in the Soviet Union right now? Well, they're pretty crappy there too. Now, there was hope for a minute, but that is largely squashed very quickly. In 1953, Joseph Stalin dies, and the U.S. rejoiced because finally this evil, vile dictator is gone. And in his place was Nikita Khrushchev. Now, Khrushchev had been a moderate voice within the Stalin regime because Stalin was incredibly oppressive. For years, There was hope that because Khrushchev seemed to be next in line and he was the moderate voice, maybe, just maybe, when he took power, things would become a little more relaxed, that he would be more relaxed compared to Stalin's very oppressive policies. However, that hope was quickly dashed because as soon as he rose to power, he began cracking down on independence movements in Eastern Europe, just as Stalin had. In other words, the new Soviet regime under Khrushchev was looking a lot like the old one under Stalin. Khrushchev was every bit as concerned with expanding Soviet power and influence as Stalin had been. So despite a brief glimpse in 1953 of hope, the Cold War was cold as ever. And then things get worse. And they get worse because communism is going to cross the pond. You see, up to this point, the Cold War is this war, we're on one hemisphere, and all the communist nations are on the other hemisphere, in Soviet Union, China, Vietnam. But suddenly, in 1959, the Cold War comes to the Western Hemisphere. Communism jumps the pond and comes to Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro will lead a successful communist revolution in Cuba and overthrow the American-backed government, U.S. government-supported Cuban dictator. Now, fun little side fact. When Castro initially took over Cuba and overthrew the U.S. government-backed dictator of Cuba, there was actually cause for celebration. In fact, many Americans actually celebrated when Castro took over, because the previous dictator under the Cuban regime was incredibly brutal, oppressive. And there was hope that maybe Castro would install a better, i.e. democratic government in Cuba. But like the issue with Khrushchev in Soviet Union, their hopes will be quickly dashed in Cuba as well, because immediately Castro will begin holding public trials and mass execution of former government officials. Castro then did what was the worst thing in the eyes of Americans. He began land redistribution programs that included the nationalization, government takeover, of foreign-owned businesses and property. And of course, we were a major investor in Cuba. We're a major trade partner for Cuba, and U.S. businessmen owned a lot of land in Cuba. And so Castro took it all, nationalized it. He owned it now as the government. And of course, what did we do? We decide to take back our trade. And of course, what does Castro do? Well, he begins to trade with the Soviet Union, which only leads us to permanently, until the 2000s, refuse to trade with Cuba. On the other hand, Castro gets closer and closer to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, meantime, said, hey, United States, if you attempt any military action in Cuba to try to get rid of Castro, we're going to meet that aggression with Soviet rockets up your butt. Threat, maybe they won't carry it out. Maybe they're too scared to get hot in the Cold War. But the threat was there. Do not mess with Castro. I'm sure that will never come back to haunt us at all. The rest of the 1950s, though, besides the ever-increasing presence of communism throughout the world, including our own backyard, just miles off our coast in Florida, the other big race issue of the 1950s was, of course, the space race. And much of the Cold War of the 1950s was actually not just the communist influence in Southeast Asia and ultimately in Cuba, but rather the space race issue. And again, this is the idea that the Cold War is not always a battle of guns, but rather of ideas, technology, superiority. Because this was a competition to see which nation, the US or the Soviet Union, could get to space. And again, it wasn't just about the impressiveness of this, It was about national security. Because the thought was, what if the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit? Could they then be able to send a nuclear bomb much quicker from Russia, from Moscow to the United States? And there at one time was a thought of, can they use satellites in space to be able to beam weapons? Again, I know this is more sci-fi and Star Trek-y ideas, but remember, it hadn't been done yet. We didn't know the full implications of going to space, and there was this fear that if the Soviets beat us there, they could really hurt us, either physically through bombs or missiles or nuclear weapons, or through just information technology by spying. And so, what if they could put a nuclear bomb into orbit and make it quickly get to the United States before we can shoot it down or take cover? And unfortunately for us, we seem to be losing the space race constantly. For much of the 1950s, the Soviets were ahead in the space race. They were the first to send a man into orbit. They're the first to put a dog into orbit, as you see pictured there. They were the first to launch a satellite into space in 1957 called Sputnik. And a month later, they launched Sputnik 2, which would contain a stray dog found in Moscow. And of course, this striked Americans' fear that there was what's called a missile gap, that we were behind the Russians, technologically speaking. If they could put a satellite, a dog, and eventually next a human into orbit, were they really ahead of us militarily? Other ways as well, such as missile technology. And so the idea was that they were ahead of us technologically speaking for space race, were they also ahead of us technologically speaking for the military arms race? Now, this really scared Americans. Was Eisenhower scared? No. He knew that we were not really behind. Yeah, they beat us to space, but militarily we were still superior. Eisenhower knew this because we were flying planes over Soviet Union, and we had lots of spies over there, that we knew that they were not ahead of us thanks to our spying on the Soviet Union. But Eisenhower couldn't tell the American people this because, hey, Eisenhower says, we're not behind. How do you know? You have to trust me, because he can't say that they were spying on the Russians, even though everyone knew we were doing it. And so in 1958, to try to catch up to the Russians, Eisenhower created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to coordinate defense and space research, which is very near and dear to our hearts here in Houston, of course, NASA. Now, this will bring us to the 1960 election. Eisenhower is going to leave with the Cold War as cold as ever, and we're going to have a new president in 1960. However, we will talk about that in our next lecture. So for now, click like, click subscribe, and until next time, bye-bye.